My Lords, the OBR will produce a new forecast in the autumn for the annual budget, and the Chancellor will take decisions based on that forecast. We will set out our fiscal plans at the budget in the usual way.
Grateful to the Noble Lord the Minister for that answer. It's very clear following recent events that this government is not going to make any meaningful reform of the welfare system and save any money, despite saying the system is broken. And it's not going to touch its existing spending plans, it said. So that means tax rises are coming, as we predicted. Now, the Chancellor said in her budget speech that it was the government's policy that it was not going to freeze tax thresholds any longer from 28-29 because that would hurt working people. She said it's the government's policy that from 28-29 thresholds will continue to be uprated. So, just to be clear, I'm not asking the Minister to write future budgets today. I'm simply asking him, can he stand at that dispatch box and repeat that those words of the Chancellor's remain the government's policy?
The Noble Lord is absolutely correct to say that there are financial consequences to the decisions that have been taken, but he will not be surprised to know that I am not going to speculate on the next budget now. We will do things in the usual way. The Chancellor will ask the OBR to produce a new forecast in the autumn for the annual budget. She will take decisions based on that forecast, and we will set out our fiscal plans at the budget in the usual way.
In all our discussions of tax and spend, so we very rarely address the third pillar, which is the state of the gilts market. Was the Minister as taken aback as I was to read from the OBR report that at the end of June, the UK 10-year bond yield was at third highest borrowing cost of any advanced economy except for New Zealand and Iceland, and that with the withdrawal of pension funds from demanding treasuries as we come to the end of defined benefit plans, there seems to be no plan in place to expand the investor base. The United States is using stablecoin as a way to increase the appetite to take up US treasuries. Are there any strategies that the UK government is pursuing? Because this is essential.
Well, the Noble Lady will know that I won't be commenting on specific financial market movements. But in terms of what she asks about stablecoin, if it's okay, I'll write to her and come back to her.
My Lords, we've just heard that the benefit system is broken. Can you remind us who broke it? And isn't this a case of just us having to clear up the mess that they left?
Well, my noble friend's absolutely right to point out the mess that we inherited and why so many of the difficult decisions that we've had to be taking had to be taken. He's absolutely right to point to the mess they left us in terms of the welfare system, where I think we had the highest proportion of people out of work, not working, the only country where worklessness had not returned to where it was pre-pandemic in the G7. Obviously, there was a mess in the public finances that we had to clear up, and that's why, as he rightly says, there are so many difficult decisions that we have had to take.
Lords, the Noble Lord, the Minister, seems to have forgotten that the cost of servicing debt, he's just given an answer to his noble friend, the cost of servicing debt is higher now than it was at the worst time in the last Conservative government. And that has to be, surely, he must take responsibility. His government has been in power for a year.
Well, Lady, think the UK has such a high stock of debt? Is it because her government doubled the national debt? Yes, it is.
I was very struck by Paul Johnson's article in the Times the other day in his position as former leader of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, in which he said we have an entirely illusory debate about tax and spend, in which there are calls from a substantial number of newspapers and at least one political party for tax cuts, but nobody ever says where they will fall or what our spending priorities are. This government has made a commitment to raise our defence spending by over 1% of GDP. I assume that all parties, all the major parties, support that. That means that tax rises are likelier than tax cuts, unless there are very severe cuts elsewhere, for example, in pensions. Could there not be some attempt by the government to have an agreement among the parties that in discussing taxes rising and falling, we discuss at the same time what spending priorities are and what cuts may necessarily be possible?
Well, the government in the spending review set out its spending plans. It set out a fully funded path to 2.6% of GDP, spending 2.6% of GDP on defence, and we have an ambition to increase that to 3% in the next Parliament, as he knows. But I'm not going to speculate on the next budget now. As I've said already, there will be an OBR forecast in the autumn for the annual budget, and we'll make decisions based on that forecast in the usual way.
The Noble Lord the Minister has just said that the government has an ambition to raise defence spending to 3% of GDP in the next Parliament. My understanding is that the Prime Minister has committed the UK to increasing it to 3.5% by 2035. Could he clarify, please?
Yes, 3% in the next Parliament. I think those commitments are for the Parliament after next.
My Lords, with rather delicate timing, the OBR published their Fiscal Risks and Sustainability report on Tuesday, and they used the word daunting for the outlook for our fiscal sustainability. And in their report, they expect health-related outflows to fall a little, not to fall, but overall, but to fall a little towards the levels of a few years ago. Perhaps the Minister could share with us how the government will explain the outlook for personal independence payments to the OBR and explain how that will be positioned.
Well, the OBR are aware of the government's policy. It's for the OBR to certify the costings of that policy in their next forecast. As I've said already, we will ask them for that forecast in time for the annual budget, and we'll make decisions based on that forecast.
This seems to be a free-for-all on putting forward our own pet economic theories. Could we ban discussion of tax cuts and tax rises and instead look at tax simplification? There's an excellent article in this week's New Statesman, a magazine that I read assiduously every week, which regurgitates the excellent work by Paul Johnson, already mentioned, pointing out that we have one of the longest tax codes in the world. George Osborne was undone by a pasty tax. Surely this minister can see to it that we can tax an ice cream cone properly and really simplify taxes, which would have a huge impact on business confidence.
Well, I'm grateful to the Noble Lord for his question. It's not, I think, for me to ban conversations about tax rises or tax cuts. I understand what he says about tax simplification. I'll take his thoughts about ice cream cones back to my colleagues in the Treasury.
My Lords, isn't it the case that we do have a very serious long-term question here? It isn't just a question of what the Chancellor is going to do in the next year. We do have underlying pressures on defence, on demography, and on top of that, we have the reforms that the previous government introduced on disabilities and on SEND in schools, which have led to rocketing bills, which something at some stage has to be done about. So won't the government engage, therefore, in a long-term debate about how we finance the welfare state that most of the British population are very strongly adhered to?
Well, my noble friend is absolutely right to point out there are the kind of long-standing and long-term challenges that we face in terms of fiscal policy. Absolutely, as the noble lord opposite said as well, the OBR Fiscal Risks Report set out some long-standing economic realities in its report this week, and that's why I think it's so important that we are committed to ensuring stability in the economy through our fiscal rules. My noble friend mentions special educational needs. He's absolutely right that the system right now is not working. Less than half of education, care and health plans are issued within the 20-week deadline, and only 22% of children with special educational needs are reaching the expected levels in maths and English. And we absolutely need to deliver better support for vulnerable children and their parents, which is why we will set out wider plans for SEND reform later this year as part of the upcoming Schools White Paper. In terms of the longer-term debate that my noble friend talks about, I'm, of course, always more than happy to discuss those issues with him.
Does the Noble Lord the Minister accept that there's a point when higher tax rates lead to lower government revenues?
We heard an example from my noble friend Lord Lee in the last question he dealt with about non-DOMs provoking some companies to change their domicile or their listing. There'll come a point when it causes people to retire early or to emigrate or to work differently. If he does accept that there's such a point, how close does he think we've got to it?
Well, the Noble Lord's just talking about the revenue maximisation point, and we're past that, for example, in tobacco taxes, and that's a deliberate government policy. So, of course, that exists. I don't think that's particularly novel.